Enterprise Management 360.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Tech Chat. Now in today's episode, I'm speaking with Imam Hock, who is the CPO at Quantexa. So welcome Imam, and thank you for coming on today's show.
Thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to sharing some of what we're seeing in the market and hopefully be useful for your audience.
I think it will. I think we've got some good areas to cover, and Quantexa is the perfect people to come and explain our topic today, because we're going to be looking at the current state of fraud and the enterprise tech solutions that are working to tackle it. And I wanted to start off the show here by talking about what's come out of the COVID-19 and the impact that we're seeing. So from a fraud perspective, what does the fraud landscape look like 1 year after the emergence of COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, actually, because I don't think anyone really knows the full extent of the level of fraud that has gone on within this period. Clearly, we see some high-level things that come out in terms of the background fraud as it's always been there, but then there's new typologies of fraud because there's been large handouts of money, things like bounce-back loans, CBILS, and those sorts of things going on. You've also got a lot more under pressure activity, should we say. So procurement's under pressure, businesses, individuals under pressure. And that pressure environment is something, of course, that fraudsters love, because the sense of urgency, the lack of time in trying to make some of those decisions in a very well quantified way has made it quite a challenge for organizations to deal with this. I mean, one stat I had is a bank that I was talking to said they'd given out as many loans in a month as they have in the last 7 years. So you can imagine the pressure on the due diligence in such a situation. So overall, I would say there's a general uptick in background fraud going on, if you look at the figures. But then there's these new typologies and probably more focused entry points by organized criminal gangs who have, sat back, looked at what's going on, understood how things are operating, and really aiming to take hundreds of millions, if not billions, out of the system by exploiting these things. The other general trend, I think, is you see that the space of cyber ability, capability, the supply chain for frauds, the availability of things like identity information, the leaks, and all of those things that are going on, that is maturing generally day in, day out. So there's an ongoing battle, if you like, for organizations, both public and private sector, to up their game to compete against that. One could say the fraudsters always seem to be like one step ahead. So they come up with an innovation, then the cyber world react. That's a cat and mouse sort of game. But I would say, again, generally, sophistication is up. The use of company structures, mule accounts, ways of sort of magicking away the money that they're making through fraud, professional organized money laundering rings, the supply chain of these sorts of capabilities is maturing all the time. And as a result, the fraud levels are increasing and getting more sophisticated and larger in size.
100% agree. It's very interesting when I was doing the research into this, because it's a perfect storm really for fraudsters and bad actors to kind of come in, because here's the distraction point over here of COVID and everything going on. And it's very easy to kind of come in from the other side, especially as we're saying with the abuse of government schemes and all these different areas that are being affected. It's really interesting to kind of see and how people aren't necessarily aware because of the distractions of other things going on going forward. And it's the way that cybercriminals are getting far more innovative with their technologically skilled, and especially when it comes to economic crimes as well. So is smart data usage enough to help organizations fight back against financial fraud?
I mean, fraud it's kind of like a security issue, and security professionals will tell you that you have to have a multi-layer line of defense. So, you have your cyber defenses, you have your prevention, you have your monitoring. As soon as you can detect frauds, how quickly you can react on it or block it or chase the money. Data-driven capability for detection, identification, understanding the modus operandi, building your defenses is a critical step. I think it was Donald Rumsfeld that coined the expression, what you know. They're the frauds that you've seen and analyze. they tell you what you know you don't know. So there's a whole bunch of frauds going on that are probably the same modus operandi, those you detected. And based on that knowledge, you should be able to then update your systems, monitor more data, do more detection and find those. However, there is always the what you don't know, you don't know. In other words, you've never seen them before, you don't know what they are, and you might not even imagine that they're happening until somebody stumbles across something and asks a question, or there's some unusual outlier behavior that you hadn't seen before. So you've got a sort of defense across that spectrum, if you like, when you're looking at it. And data is a critical element, both in terms of the detection as well as understanding the modus operandi to put in place your defenses. I think organizations are getting better at it. Unfortunately, organizations have latency. You know, whether it's the private sector, projects have got to be started up, you've got to get funding, you go to the board to get approval, you do you could be looking at a year for a big data-oriented project. Of course, the fraudsters are a lot quicker than that. And the same is true for government. You have to go through procurement processes and so on and so forth. So data is definitely a critical step. There are many fraud typologies that are hitting a lot of people. So some are very specialists and always have been, you know, credit card related frauds. But now there's the generic space of procurement fraud, general phishing attacks, attempts to, you know, redirect payments in the commercial world and so on and so forth. The frauds against credits or loans of some description. So all of this very critical to monitor a lot of data and have an accurate picture of what's happening.
Definitely not. It's as you said, speed is so crucial, but sometimes not a resource that people are afforded. And when you have so many data sets and information to process, it can make life difficult. But it's why we have processes in place, and it's why we have people like you at Quantexa. And I wanted to quickly kind of talk about Quantexa to wrap up the show here, because I find it very interesting, the model that you guys bring in and what you guys bring forward to the market. So can you give us some examples of how organizations are benefiting from Quantexa's entity resolution-based solution to fraud, particularly when it comes to targeting anti-money laundering?
Yeah, so the problem with trying to detect fraud or the laundering of money, obviously the proceeds of crime, is you've got a lot of data, but traditionally people might think, oh, I can just create a model or a machine learning capability or a set of scenarios, just going to look at the data and understand what's going on. Mm-hmm. The reality is it's a lot more complex than that, because the world is a series of networks of interactions. You know, somebody makes a payment to someone else. Someone has just created a company and they become a director or an ultimate beneficial owner of that business, and they're using it to launder the money. All of these things are complicated network structures that you can understand by not only taking your internal data, your transactions and your own customer KYC or your supplier KYS data, but then also enriching it with third-party data. So for instance, things like the company structures and ownerships, things like the leaks that are out there, offshore entities. But bringing that data together is a really hard problem, because, you know, you may have in a record around somebody who's a known convicted money launderer, first name, surname, date of birth. And then somewhere else you may have in a leaks file, first name, surname, address. But obviously if it's a common first name, surname, then it's a problem. How do you join those? So this is what is called the entity resolution problem. It's like that single view, not just individuals, but companies, their structures, addresses, so that you see how all the data joins. And then you have to look at how it connects into these networks of relationships. Who's owning which companies, who's transacting with who, who's connecting to what. So that's your first problem space. And that's what we help our customers do, whether they're government or private sector customers. Now, examples of how you use that. You take your data. Most people are probably thinking, okay, I'm going to do some analysis. I'll dump my data into a data lake or a NoSQL database or something like that. And then I'll run up a set of models on top of that. What we do is we make sure you've got single views across that data, and we make sure it's linked into those graphs and networks. They then become the input into your model. And your model is then seeing the big picture. The key of any analytical model here, when you're using context or the networks and single views as inputs, is three metrics. Am I finding as much of what I need to find? Am I detecting the risk? am I doing it without creating loads of false positives, this term that you hear about? Because you just end up working stuff that leads nowhere. And then ultimately, is it quicker to review what I've been presented? When I see that transaction, if I see the context and the companies and the structures and the people and their offshore entities in a picture, can I make a decision quickly? If you get those three things right, you've got a great operation at interdicting fraud or money laundering. And that's how we help these large banks and government departments with what they're doing to try and prevent this fraud.
Excellent stuff. It's an amazing kind of structure, and I love the points that you have in terms of detecting and helping from that element. So it's really great to hear in your own words there, Imam. And all I can say is thanks for coming on today's show, walking us through all of this, and giving really great insight. It's been great chatting with you.
Thank you very much. I mean, we're all here to do one thing when it comes to data, is to try and prevent the bad guys doing what they're doing. And if we can get it all right, we'll make a big difference, and that money can be spent on something far more valuable
or enjoyable
by the governments and those institutions. So thanks a lot for the opportunity.
Thanks, Imam, and thank you everyone who watched this episode. We'll also be back next week with another episode in our Tech Chat series. In the meantime, you can join the conversation at EM360Tech on Twitter and LinkedIn. Subscribe to this YouTube channel, and for more great daily content, head on over to em360tech.com.